Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Today I got a real doozy for you. Something that's going to blow your brain off. Something that's going to wow your pants off. And something that's going to equip you on how to quickly dismantle any objections to I.O. without any shadow of a doubt. Because a lot of times when people come against I.O., they come against I.O. with a lot of nonsense, right? A lot of different angles that they think are defeating I.O. They quote Old Testament passages that they're inappropriately and incorrectly applying to their selves today, such as Isaiah passages where it literally talks about the literal cities and walls of Jerusalem and the literal stone temple being rebuilt and re-erected, and the people coming back and dwelling in the city and eating food and drinking drink and having children and being merry in the streets. And they apply that to themselves today, right? So they don't have any clue that that was actually speaking of the Second Temple period, the return to Zion Second Temple period, that is. And they use that and they quote these passages as if us IOers should stop dead in their tracks and say, wait a minute, they're right. They are these spiritual Israelites. But no, we know that that had to be put in its proper context. And that what we see in the New Testament is related to those things in a sense, yes, because it follows the same motif, the same Israel gathered back to their Jerusalem motif. However, it's a new Jerusalem in the heavens, not made with hands, and it was a limited short-term mission that would take place before the coming of the Redeemer, hence why they were in the last days. Now, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how to quickly dismantle any objection that comes against you, in particular in regards to whom Paul was writing to, right? Because a lot of people say, no, Paul's letters were written to true pagans, right? There's no way they were written to these elect Israelites. You're totally way off. It's totally inappropriate to assume so, blah, blah, blah. So what we're going to do is we have a little formula that we can show you, or I as in we as in I, have a little formula that we can show you, that I can show you on how to quickly stop all opponents dead in their tracks, okay? And here it is. It's very simple. Pay attention, and I'll repeat it. You want to start in John chapter 7 and show these people what the Jews said about Jesus, right? In John 7, what happens in John 7? Well, the Jews are speaking and they're discussing this Jesus guy and they're like perplexed, like, holy cow, is he who he says he is? Is he a Messiah figure? Is he the one? And of course they know the history and the predictions and the prophets and how they all spoke of unity and unified action with the two houses of Israel and yada, yada, yada. And the kingdoms being brought back together, restoring one, under one leader, one shepherd sort of thing. So they're asking, is he the one? And look at what the Jews say in John 7. I'm paraphrasing because I'm driving over a bridge that's about a half a mile up. And if I make one error, I'll go tumbling down into the frigid cold waters. So I'm paraphrasing here, but Jesus said, the Jews say, where does he intend to go that we cannot follow? Because Jesus had just told them that where he's going, they could not come. And they asked themselves, where does he intend to go that we cannot follow? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach them? Right? So what do we see here very clearly? Well, number one, we see that the Jews understood in the first century, in the last days, during Jesus' mission, that there was a dispersed party of individuals living among the Greeks, among the nations, right? There was a dispersion that was outside of the boundaries of Judaism, right? Because, first of all, if these were Jews that they were speaking about when they talked about the dispersion, I hardly doubt, or I highly doubt, that they would be saying that they could not go to them, right? A Jew not being able to go to another Jew? That doesn't make much sense. Of course not. They're talking about the dispersion. They're talking about this other party, the sheep not of this fold, that there was enmity with, right? Because, of course, that's why they cannot go, because there's enmity over the law, which Paul also touched upon in his epistles. But that's another story. So we can understand that the Jews knew and understood there to be a dispersion among the Greeks in the first century. Now, remember that, okay? Now, when we come to 1 Peter chapter 1, okay, we're going to jump around a little bit here, but I want to show you how easy this is. When we set that proper understanding, what I just showed you in John 7, that there were dispersed ones living amongst the Greeks, and the Jews knew this, they had knowledge of this, and there was enmity between the Jews and these dispersed ones. Now let's take a look at, what was I just saying here? Now let's take a look at what Paul said. What Peter said. Sorry, traffic. In 1 Peter, Peter's writing his letter, and he addresses it to the elect of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Asia, Cappadocia, Bithynia, blah, blah, blah. Now, I want to ask you a question. Do you think that the dispersion, the elect of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Asia that Peter's writing to, is the same dispersion that the Jews in John 7 knew were out there among the Greeks? Of course it is, right? To assume otherwise would to be a bonehead, right? That's what it would be. Of course he's writing to the same dispersion. The elect of the dispersion among the nations is what he's writing to. Okay, so Peter, again, acknowledges the fact that in the first century, and he reveals the fact that in the first century, there were elect of the dispersion living amongst the nations. Okay, so now we have John and Peter, well, the book of John and Peter, both confirming that the dispersion existed among the nations in the first century. Now here's where it gets interesting. In 2 Peter chapter 3, we see Peter mention Paul. He's writing to the same audience, that being the elect of the dispersion in the nations, and he says, as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you in all of his epistles, speaking to you of these things. So Peter, writing to the dispersed ones, right, among the Greeks, the same ones that the Jews knew there was enmity towards and they couldn't be around, Peter's writing to them and saying, hey, I'm writing to you about the same things that our beloved brother Paul wrote to you in all of his epistles. Now, who did Paul write to in all of his epistles? Who was Paul the apostle of? He was the apostle of the Gentiles. Okay? He flat out says it. He was the apostle dedicated to the nations for a purpose, for a reason, for a mission. And so when we understand that Paul's letters were going to the nations, Corinth, Rome, they were going to the nations, we can look at what Peter says in that second epistle in chapter 3, where he says, as Paul also wrote to you in all of his epistles. So clearly, folks, here's how it ties together. If Paul wrote to these, aka Gentiles in these foreign nations, like Rome and Corinth, Colossae, if he's writing to them, okay, but if Peter calls them, if he's writing to them and referring to them as Gentiles or nations, right, and Peter refers to them as the elect of the dispersion, well, then we have a problem, right? Because clearly they're the same audience. Peter just said it. He said, as Paul also wrote to you in all of his epistles. Well, who did Paul write to? He wrote to supposed Gentile churches, right? Wrong. Paul was writing to the elect of the dispersion just as Peter was. That's clear. That's undeniable fact. Now, I'm not saying again that the story is true. I'm just saying, according to the story, both Peter in his epistles and Paul in all of his epistles were writing to the elect of the dispersion in the nations, aka the dispersion amongst the Greeks that the Jews spoke of in John chapter 7. So do you see how quickly one can dismantle the argument that Paul was not writing to the elect of the dispersion? Of course he was. There's two parties that are mentioned in John 7. You have the Jews who are speaking, and you have the dispersion among the nations, or among the Greeks, who they're referring to as having enmity with. Two parties, okay? Jew and dispersion among the nations, otherwise known as Jew and Gentile. Very, very simple, folks. Very simple stuff. But yet people want to complicate it and make it extremely difficult to understand and throw different scenarios in there and whatnot. But really, there's no complicating it at all. It's crystal clear. Again, to summarize, Peter in chapter 1, verse 1 writes to the elect of the dispersion in the nations. The elect of the dispersion in the nations, meaning these are dispersed ones living in the nations, living among the Greeks. Okay? He's writing to them. He's not writing to Gentiles. He's not writing to any old Joe Blow pagan. He's not writing to you and me. He's writing to the elect of the dispersion, the dispersed ones living among the nations. Same ones that Revelation 5 said would come out from among the nations and touch not was unclean, and he would forgive them. So they're coming out from the nations in 1 Peter, they're the elect of the dispersion living amongst the nations in 1 Peter 1. Peter again writes to them, refers to them again, and says that Paul also wrote to them in all of his epistles. Well, do you guys have any record that Paul was the apostle to the Jews? I sure don't. That's not what the story says. So if all of Paul's epistles were written to the elect of the dispersion, as Peter says, and if Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, as he clearly says, and as the story clearly posits, then that means that the elect of the dispersion are the same ones that Paul wrote to in all of his epistles. And of course, tying that back to John chapter 7, we can see that the dispersed ones among the Greeks are the same as the elect of the dispersion, and they're the same as Paul's audience in all of his epistles. Folks, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like a Rooski, share it with all your friends and family, preferably just before the holidays, so you can have some interesting discussions around the dinner table. And let me know what you think. Leave a comment, and we'll catch you on that flip side. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.